Hey everyone, so in today's video, what we're going to explore is a question I was recently asked in a mentoring session with a therapist. And she asked me, do we need the foot to be able to pronate in order to access hip extension and in order to experience more load and contraction through the hip extensors? Okay, and this is the reason she asked this is because this is a statement that you might see floating around Instagram, that we need the foot to pronate in order to get load into the hip extensors or in order to sense load into the hip extensors. And my response to this is yes and no. You can allow the foot to pronate, but there are other ways in which you can shift that load into the there's other ways in which you can allow for an increased demand onto the hip extensors, into the hip extensors without needing to pronate the foot. Pronating the foot allows for a little bit more of a change in the kinematics. Now, we'll discuss this from two different perspectives, a kinematic perspective and a kinetic perspective. But if you remember back to previous videos, when we discussed the difference between kinematics and kinetics, kinematics really reflects the change in the behavior of segments of tissues in space and relative to each other without considering the forces that create those changes in behavior. Okay, whereas kinetics gives us that insight into how forces influence that change in segmental behavior. So when we're looking at kinetics, we're looking at the force vectors moving through the system, particularly the entry point of force vectors, ground reaction forces, specifically in this video, that's going to influence the demand, the internal force demand on certain muscular tissues. Okay, so foot pronation is obviously a range of motion. It's a movement excursion. Okay, now one of the key things to consider there is what happens to the distribution of pressure across the foot when you pronate your foot. Okay, so if you come up into a standing position now, and you have your toes facing forward, and let's say we're looking at the left foot here. If I was to rotate my body to the right side, where I'm pronating my left foot, I'm supinating my right foot, naturally you're going to feel the pressure shift medially, but you should also feel how the pressure shifts distally into the metatarsal heads. Okay, and on the right side, because the right foot is supinating, you should almost feel the pressure shift laterally, but not just laterally, it shifts posteriorly. Okay, because also what's happening in my pelvis here is that my left pelvis is going forward, the right side of my pelvis is moving backwards. So it's almost pulling me backwards in space into the heel. This is pushing me forward into the front of the foot. And so, yes, what's going to happen there is that's going to couple with almost a medial deviation of the whole limb. Okay, so we're going to see and get a little bit more femoral adduction in that scenario, which can allow us to get more length into the glutes. Purely from a length tension relationship standpoint, when you get more length into a muscular tissue, you are going to experience more tension in that muscular tissue. Okay, and when you supinate the foot, for example, that can do the opposite. It can bring the foot again into supination. It can drag the tibia into external rotation. It can drag the femur into external rotation. I'm going to pull that limb laterally, so you might get more shortening of that lateral and posterior glute. And when the muscle shortens, you're not going to experience as much tension in that muscle. You're not going to experience as much internal tension and load in that muscle. You may feel the glute more, but it's not secondary to an increase in the amount of tension in that muscle. But the reason I wanted to discuss this from a kinematic standpoint, that would be more of a kinematic perspective. And I think that's why a lot of people will say you need the foot to pronate, because of that cascade up the chain proximally where the tibia internally rotates, the femur internally rotates and adducts, and you get a bit more length into the glute. And then you'll see people coupling that foot pronation with a little bit of a knee bend, which brings the femur into a bit more flexion, and then they turn into it. They rotate the pelvis towards that side, so you're just getting a lot of length into the posterior lateral hip. But what is not considered is, again, the fact that that weight will shift from the midfoot or from the heel into the forefoot when the foot pronates. And that's going to change the entry point of the force vector into your system. Okay, and it's going to change the ground reaction force vector as an external force vector. So the entry point of that into the system relative to the joint that we're considering is going to influence the muscular tissues and the demand of the muscular tissues around that joint. So let's consider with the left leg here. And we've discussed this briefly in previous videos as well. But let's say, for example, I'm in a split squat position here. I've got my knee just over my midfoot here, and my right femur is perpendicular to the ground. My trunk is more upright. If I crush through the heel now and try and hover that right knee from the ground and just hold, I'm going to feel a certain amount of load into my glute. I'm going to feel a certain amount of load into my quadricep, because the force vector, the ground reaction force vector, because I'm trying to crush through my heel, is entering through here. So it's moving behind the knee. So it's going to increase the internal knee extensor moment. And because it's traveling through the thigh here, there's a certain distance between that force vector and the hip extensors. So it's going to have an influence over the demand on the hip extensors. But now if I don't try to pronate my foot, supinate my foot, I just try to shift that weight from the heel into the forefoot. And I do the exact same thing. I crush down to the forefoot. I can hover that heel from the ground. It doesn't even have to be a significant hover. It just has to be an unweighting of the heel from the ground. And then I'm hovering that right knee from the ground. Okay. What you should feel there is a little bit more demand into the hip extensors. Okay. Not because you did anything fancy around the foot, you just shifted where that ground reaction force vector is entering the system. So it moves from here to here, which is a much bigger distance away from the hip joint. So that increases the internal hip extension demand. Okay, that force vector entering here, that's your external hip flexion. It creates an external hip flexion moment. It's trying to put a bend into the hip. But because it enters further away from the hip, it's going to increase that demand on the hip extensors. Okay. Now, why this is important is because when you pronate your foot, it's also going to shift that weight from the heel into the forefoot. Okay. So it's just another way of saying you're shifting the weight into the metatarsal heads. You're shifting the weight distally into the foot, okay? But that doesn't mean there's necessarily anything magic about foot pronation, okay? You don't need the foot to pronate in order to get load into the glutes. It has an influence from a kinematic standpoint. Yes, it creates this coupling effect proximally, where we are going to get that a little bit more tibial internal rotation, for more internal rotation, which is going to get length, and for more adduction, which is going to get more length into the glutes, which may allow us to experience more tension in that muscle. But we could also have a foot that's very supinated. Okay, if I really supinate my foot and shift that load into the metatarsal heads, and I even have my femur a little bit more horizontally abducted and I lift up, I still feel quite a lot of load into my glutes here now. Okay, I can feel a strong demand into my glutes in this position here. Okay, but my foot is supinated, but I'm also shifting the weight into the forefoot at the same time. So it doesn't mean that just because you're supinating your foot that you are going to shift that weight into the heel. I'm lifting my heel here. So from a kinematic standpoint, my foot's supinated. But from a force vector standpoint, entry standpoint, it's entering through the metatarsal heads purely because I'm lifting the heel from the ground. And that's why you have to consider things from a kinematic standpoint and a kinetic standpoint, okay? So I just wanted to talk about that statement there, because people will end up thinking that foot pronation has this kind of magic quality proximally up the chain. It certainly can create a lower limb that's a bit more flexible and adaptable, a limb that has a bit more give to it, certainly. But there's not necessarily anything magic that needs to happen there in order to get more load into your glute. Because naturally, from a multi-joint standpoint, again, we shouldn't be thinking about what the foot is really doing if we're trying to get load into the glute on a day-to-day basis. It should just be self-organized, okay? But of course, from a rehab standpoint, when we are trying to be more mindful and thoughtful as to how we're getting load into certain muscular tissues and through certain joint structures, we have to kind of step back and consider, well, why might that be getting load into the glute? Is there another reason as to when that foot pronates that we feel a lot more load and we sense a lot more tension into the glute? Yes, again, from a kinematic standpoint, it does make sense that we get more length there. But from a kinetic standpoint, we also have to consider that with foot pronation, naturally with the whole foot on the ground, and when that foot pronates, there is going to be a shifting of that pressure distally into the metatarsal heads, which is going to influence the entry point of that ground reaction force vector, okay? So again, something I think helpful to understand, because it allows us to push past those kind of absolute statements that try to connect one specific behavior of a certain segment that's very far away from the hip, the foot to the hip, for example. Of course, we know that there's a connection there, but it doesn't mean that in order to get load into the glutes, you have to have a foot that pronates, okay? It can be pronated, it can be supinated. There's kinematic and kinetic reasons for it, okay? So hopefully that made sense. I think it can be very helpful when trying to organize the foot segment when you are trying to get load into the hip extensors, but it gives you more options through which you can do that, okay? So if you have a client, for example, that really struggles to pronate their foot, but your intention from a rehab standpoint is to actually get load into the hip extensors, then you don't have to spend ages trying to get their foot to pronate first. You just have to get load into the metatarsal heads, and there's many ways through which you can do that as long as you understand things from a kinematic and a kinetic standpoint, okay? So hopefully that made sense. Like always, if you have any more questions, please let us know below.